advent of the new woman in the 1920s was short-lived. On October 29, 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, plunging the world into a devastating economic depression. Across the Western world, millions were out of work, starvation was rampant, and hope was a scarce commodity. The predicament of women in the Great Depression was particularly dire. All of the progress made during the Great War and the era of emancipation in the 20s went down the drain. With the massive unemployment, families could only afford to send off one main breadwinner, most usually the male head of household. Therefore, women were forced to retreat further into the domestic sphere. The shortened skirts were traded in for more demure, homely, practical clothing, and women lost their fragile independence as they became once more dependent on their male counterparts to care for them. However, the social dynamics were once again overturned with the outbreak of World War II. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland and Europe broke out into battle. When the U.S. joined the war effort after Pearl Harbor in 1941, the failing economy was jump-started, and women began to visibly re-emerge in society. The men were once again off to Europe to fight for their country, and just as in World War I, women were called upon to take over the crucial jobs in support of their nation. The industrial economy of the U.S. was reoriented to suit every munitions and mechanical need to support the war effort. It was not uncommon to see women heading to factories to build tanks and planes. Women took up positions in offices, became medical practitioners, factory workers, and even found themselves filling in a gap in professional sports, evident in the popularity of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Their freedom was short-lived, however. A brief 4 years later, the Allies defeated their enemies and the boys were on their way home. After the dust had settled from the raucous D-Day and V-Day celebrations, the vets returned and wanted their jobs back. Just like in the post-World War I years, women were forced back out of the workforce and into the home. This time, however, women faced tighter restrictions in domestic life. Beginning in the 1940s, home life for women became even more oppressive with the development of suburban subdivisions. With funding from the GI Bill, vets could purchase idyllic homes near good schools. But the illusion of the American dream, created by places such as Levittown, hid the inclusive and stifling reality fostered in the suburbs. Homes were purposefully located further from work centers with the intent to create a realm of peaceful domesticity as an escape for men from the pressures of the real world. Men benefited from the system. However, as feminist author Betty Friedan observed,
woman's world was confined to her own body and beauty, the charming of man, the bearing of babies, and the physical care and serving of husband, children, and home.
In an attempt to supposedly help women adjust to their newly domestic lifestyles in the post-war era, the popular media developed an image of the perfect woman. Throughout the 50s and 60s, U.S. women's magazines, print ads, television and radio shows, news reports, and scientific studies all propagated a distorted image of femininity that overemphasized content with domesticity. For example, popular women's magazines such as McCall's, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, and Women's Home Companion were all run and edited by men, with minimal female input. In the 1920s, the great era of women's emancipation, women's magazines published stories of quite a different sort. In the era of the new woman, magazine stories tended to describe bold young women who held careers, dreams, and goals, and even put off marriage. The moral of the story in the 1920s was often that women needed to break free of their constraints and figure out who they were as individuals first and foremost. In the 1950s, however, the very same women's magazines suddenly stopped publishing thought-provoking articles, philosophical conversation starters, or opinions and news of world events. Instead, articles focused on cleaning tricks, packing healthy school lunches, and stories that increasingly lacked depth. The new heroines married as young as possible and believed it was their duty to bear as many children as they could. They found fulfillment in driving their kids to school and soccer practice, attending PTA meetings, and having the neighbors' wives over for bridge twice a week. This image soon spread beyond women's magazines. As a result, women became increasingly indoctrinated into a new cult of domesticity, hidden under the guise of the so-called happy housewife. Betty Friedan observed,
The suburban housewife, she was the dream image of the young American woman and the envy, it was said, of women all over the world.
Women in the 50s stopped having interests that deviated from the domestic image and began to honestly believe that the culmination of their existence as a woman was their role as wife and mother. Girls started to become engaged at as young as 17 and 18, opting to skip college and settle down. Even college women shifted their attitude. In the 1950s, most girls became engaged before graduation, fulfilling the unofficial goal of getting a ring by spring that was prominent at even the most elite women's institutions, such as Smith and Wellesley. Women no longer had career aspirations, and as Betty Friedan observed, they instead
gloried in their role as women and wrote proudly on the census blank, occupation, housewife.
They cavalierly threw away the right to higher education that their mothers and grandmothers had fought for, and were now merely going to college in order to find themselves a husband and then let him take care of things for her. This attitude is dramatized in this scene from the movie Mona Lisa Smile.
Contemporary art.
No, that's just an advertisement.
Quiet. Today you just listen. What will the future scholars see when they study us? A portrait of women today? There you are, ladies. The perfect likeness of a Wellesley graduate, magna cum laude, doing exactly what she was trained to do. Slide. A Rhodes Scholar. I wonder if she recites Chaucer while she presses her husband's shirt's slide. Now you physics majors can calculate the mass and volume of every meatloaf you make. Slide. A girdle to set you free. What does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean? I give up. You win. The smartest women in the country. I didn't realize that by demanding excellence, I would be challenging. What did it say? What did it say? The roles you were born to fill. Is that right? The roles you were born to fill? It's my mistake.
It was often their formal education that spurred the widespread discontent that became apparent in the late 50s and early 60s. Numerous women suffered in silence for over a decade, feeling unfulfilled, experiencing discontent with their lives. Many young to middle-aged wives went to psychoanalysts and described their feelings of deep depression, bitterness, and dissatisfaction. Often, Betty Friedan found that for many women,
the feeling gets so strong she runs out of the house and walks through the streets, or she stays inside her house and cries, or her children tell her a joke and she doesn't laugh because she doesn't hear it.
But these women were quite usually deeply conflicted as well. Housewives who were unhappy with their seemingly ideal lives were forced to hide their true anguish beneath a smile because
what kind of woman was she if she did not feel this mysterious fulfillment waxing the kitchen floor? She was so ashamed to admit her dissatisfaction that she never knew how many other women shared it.
The public was soon made aware of the plight of the housewife when psychoanalysts from across the country began to notice distinct patterns of the problem that has no name, experienced by so many women. Scientists tried to conduct studies to see if this was due to a chemical imbalance. Magazines continued turning out stories in an attempt to further brainwash women, and intellectuals blamed women's higher education for the problem. The latter became the most popular explanation. Women were overeducated and therefore had a hard time adjusting to their new, simpler lives of domesticity, where they would have no cares outside of their own white picket fences. It was even argued that there was really no more use for women to attend college if all it would lead to is trouble. Of course, women who had spent 4 years discussing Chaucer, Dickens, Plato, and Aristotle would feel somehow emptier when their lives were filled with groceries, appliances, school lunches, and Little League games. However, the public was ignoring the root of the problem, often out of ignorance but also out of animosity. Many Americans believed that the new generation of housewives were being unreasonable, upsetting the status quo, or being outright selfish. How could such simple creatures dare to want more? How could their ideal lives, fulfilling the roles they were born to play, be unfulfilling? Yet the problem remained. Far too many women were so repressed by their dull suburban lives that they had to let out primal screams when home alone before they could bear to continue their tasks of cooking and cleaning. In 1963, everything began to change. This was the year that Betty Friedan published her radical book, The Feminine Mystique, which critically examined the so-called plight of the housewife and what she called the problem that has no name. She valiantly took up the torch of the feminist movement by stating,
"We can no longer ignore that voice within women that says, 'I want something more than my husband and my children and my home.'"
Friedan made some bold assertions in her study, claiming that this problem experienced by the vast majority of women in the U.S. was a lack of fulfillment. She claimed that the image society had so carefully crafted was taken far too literally, forming a generation of women who had no access to worldly or intellectual pursuits and therefore had no interest in them. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, Friedan did not place the blame solely on society. She also reprimanded the new generation of housewives, claiming that women in the 40s and 50s were suddenly faced opportunities just recently won: college, jobs, the vote, and general independence, and that this situation scared them. Girls reached the end of high school or college and suddenly didn't know what to do with themselves anymore. They were terrified to be responsible for their lives and decisions. Friedan speculates that young women married early in order to remain in a state of immaturity or childhood, and let their husbands take care of them so that they never again have to bear the burden of responsibility. In her book, Friedan states,
"The housewife has no identity except as a wife and a mother. She does not know who she is herself."
The same year that Friedan published her radical study and began public speaking tours, a burgeoning journalistic voice burst onto the scene with a scandalous expose of New York's Playboy clubs and the overworked, underpaid reality of life as a bunny waitress. That journalist was Gloria Steinem. Both she and Friedan were graduates of the elite women's college, Smith, and were extremely dedicated to human rights activism. Despite being the founding editor of New York Magazine, Steinem faced opposition in trying to write and publish articles on serious news issues due to her gender. However, in 1971, Steinem founded Miss Magazine, a radical feminist publication which addressed socially unsavory topics such as birth control, abortion, and domestic violence. In the same year, Steinem teamed up with Friedan and other prominent feminists to form the National Women's Political Caucus, which fought for women's civil rights. With the publication of Friedan's groundbreaking text, which sold 5 million copies in only 7 years, the women of the U.S. realized that they had subjected themselves to a status less than full personhood. The women began to wake up and demand what they truly wanted, and thus the second wave of feminism began. In this modern era, women were not united under one single goal, like their foremothers who fought for suffrage nearly 100 years earlier. Instead, women fought for a collection of rights ranging from employment to discrimination to health and privacy. However, similar to the first wave, the new feminist coalitions were headed by pioneering women like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. Though the women's movement of the modern age was fighting for less tangible goals, there was still very real discrimination and opposition to overcome. In the workforce, women were consistently earning significantly less than men. In 1960, it was only 60 cents to every man's dollar. A major milestone in the fight for job equality for women came in the form of the 1963 Equal Pay Act, which mandated that men and women would be paid equally for performing the same job duties. Another major breakthrough came in 1964 with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, particularly Title VIII, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, sex, and other denominations. With this act came the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, in order to enforce the mandates in the act. However, despite receiving 50,000 complaints of gender discrimination in just 5 years, the EEOC refused to act, and thus a group of 28 women felt compelled to found the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which focused on women's civil rights issues. Female activists during this era did not focus solely on job equality, but also on body, health, and privacy issues. In 1960, when the FDA approved birth control pills, women experienced an important liberation milestone. With the wide availability of the pill, women were fully in charge of when they would have children and how many, which allowed even married women the opportunity to have a career. On the other hand, abortion became a public issue when, in 1968, the National Abortion Rights Action League was founded. But it was not until 1973, through the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, that a woman's right to an abortion was established. However, these issues all related back to the umbrella goal of changing public perception. At the crux of the late 20th century women's liberation movement was the attempt to escape from the oppressive image of the happy housewife. Women wanted to prove to society that they were equally as capable as men, and change society's attitude towards women. Taking inspiration from the civil rights and anti-war movements, feminists held rallies, sit-ins, and peaceful protests. And in 1968, over 200 women from across the nation held the first Women's Liberation Conference in Chicago. In that same year, the feminist group NOW, among other radical women's groups, staged a protest in Atlantic City against the Miss America pageant. The women took over the boardwalk just outside the building where the pageant was held, and took turns throwing away icons of traditional womanhood and female oppression into a freedom trash can. They continued to demonstrate into the night with signs proclaiming all women are beautiful. A handful of protesters even found their way into the pageant, where they hung a women's liberation banner and chanted, "Freedom for women, no more Miss America," until they were forcibly removed. Ultimately, in 1970, a collection of feminist groups persuaded Congress to reconsider the Equal Rights Amendment. This was originally written by Alice Paul and introduced to Congress in 1923, at which time it failed to pass. By 1972, however, the ERA had been passed by both congressional houses and began the ratification process. If ratified, the amendment would guarantee equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. However, the amendment was actively blocked and never received the necessary number of ratifications, and therefore failed once again. Though there were many setbacks throughout this era, feminists and women in general achieved several significant female firsts. In 1957, the number of women voting was equal to the number of men for the first time. Bobby Gibb unofficially participated in the 1966 Boston Marathon and is recognized as the first woman to run and complete it. By 1978, more women were entering college than men, and in 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman ever appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Despite the notable strides made by women over these years, at present we still face numerous obstacles. The third wave does exist. There is still a glass ceiling that needs to be broken. There is still sexism and discrimination that needs to be addressed. There are still negative attitudes and misconceptions about women which need to be corrected. Today's women owe so much to the struggles of their foremothers. So many aspects of everyday life that we take for granted are luxuries which should be savored. The right to vote, the right to a college education, the right to participate in sports, the right to work outside the home, the right to our own bodies, the right to legal protections and equality. For so many women before us, full personhood was a rare and fragile commodity, and therefore it is something that women today should respect and appreciate. And though we no longer need to go on hunger strike, there are still obstacles which we need to overcome together, because though women work, they still earn significantly less than men. And according to recent figures, it is not expected that the average woman will out-earn the average man until 2024. Today, women are only 4% of Fortune 500 CEOs and hold only 5% of clout positions in the mainstream media. In politics, the United States is in 90th place in terms of female participation in legislature. In fact, only 18% of congressional seats are held by women, despite the fact that we make up 50% of the population. While in Rwanda's equivalent body, women comprise over 50% of the seats. And of the 196 countries in the world, only 33 have had at least one female leader. But the United States is not one of them. The major ideological barrier that still needs to be overcome is the way in which women are viewed and discussed in society. There are issues with the normalization of violence in contemporary society, particularly violence against women. In this day and age, nearly 25% of all girls will experience some sort of dating violence, and every 2 minutes someone is sexually assaulted in the United States. Yet 54% of all sexual assaults go unreported, and 97% of rapists will never see the inside of a jail, mostly due to society's inclination to place the blame on the victim instead of on the attacker. Even today, women are viewed in the light of traditional feminine values. Women in the public eye are judged solely on their appearance and their parenting skills, instead of on their talent or intellectual merit. According to the mainstream media, a woman is worthy of public admiration if she is beautiful, not haggard, if she wants or has a family, and based on how well she treats her husband or raises her children, while men face none of these criticisms. Gloria Steinem recently told the New York Daily News,
"We've demonstrated that women can do what men do, but not yet that men can do what women do. That's why most women have two jobs, one inside the home and one outside it, which is impossible. The truth is that women can't be equal outside the home until men are equal in it."
The most important thing for modern women to do is to educate themselves on where we started, on what we've been through, on where we are now, what issues we face today, and where we are headed. So let's take a moment to reflect on the women who span centuries, who have boosted us up on their shoulders and backs, who have fought against all odds and given up everything they had and more so that we could be right here where we are today.
Gonna take a sentimental journey, gonna set my heart at ease, gonna make a sentimental journey to renew old memories. Got my bag, got my reservation, spent each dime I could afford. I'm like a child in wild anticipation. I long to hear that